In November 1983, the Soviet Union placed its forces in Eastern Europe on high alert. Nuclear forces were put on standby, with warheads loaded into bombers and mobile launch vehicles, as many in the Soviet military feared a nuclear first strike was imminent. In Western Europe, a war game codenamed Able Archer had begun, unknowingly bringing the world to the brink of war. Hello, this is Russell, and welcome to Anything History. This is such a fascinating story, where the atmosphere of rhetoric and paranoia, combined with a hyper-realistic military exercise, nearly led to the outbreak of World War III. Able Archer was not a precursor to a nuclear first strike, but in reality, it was just a NATO training exercise designed to simulate real-world conditions that would lead to war. The hyper-realistic exercise and the tensions surrounding the Cold War had fed into Soviet fears of a first strike. Able Archer 83 was preceded by 6 previous exercises that saw the deployment of nearly 100,000 troops in NATO war games. This, of course, heightened tensions and stressed the new leadership in both the United States and the USSR. The election of President Ronald Reagan in 1980 marked a change in the Soviet perception of Western intentions. During the first part of the 1980s, Reagan in fact made anti-Soviet rhetoric and increased military spending a cornerstone of his presidency. Reagan's attitude towards the Soviet Union was reflected in a speech on March 8, 1983.
Declare its omnipotence over individual man and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth. They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
In November 1982, Yuri Andropov became the leader of the Soviet Union following the death of Leonid Brezhnev. Like Reagan, Andropov was an aggressive leader. He was prone to believing that the American Central Intelligence Agency was behind the scenes of every major world event. Andropov was also an advocate for the brutal crackdown during the uprising of Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1968. He believed that the Czechoslovakian reform movement was vulnerable to CIA manipulation, and that they would ultimately want to seek NATO membership. Andropov also gave his support to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, convinced that the CIA had overthrown the Soviet-backed leadership. In April of 1983, the U.S. Pacific Fleet conducted the largest naval exercise of the era. Fleet X-83 involved 40 ships, 23,000 airmen, and 300 aircraft operating in the North Pacific. It didn't help tensions that, during the exercise, 4 American F-14 Tomcats flew directly over the Soviet military airbase on Lenny Island in the North Pacific. Tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union escalated further. On September 1, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down by a Soviet military interceptor over international waters. All 269 passengers of the 747 lost their lives when the plane went down over the Sea of Japan. For the Soviet Union, perhaps their biggest threat during this era was the deployment of the Pershing II missile system to West Germany. Once deployed, the system could hit targets deep inside Soviet territory in as little as 6 minutes. From the Soviet Union's perspective, the only way to survive a first strike was to be ready to respond at the first sign of aggression. In March 1983, Ronald Reagan announced plans to develop an anti-ballistic missile system, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Nicknamed Star Wars by the press, the initiative threatened to upset the delicate balance of power that had been achieved by the threat of mutual assured destruction. From the Soviet perspective, there was a narrow window to launch a nuclear strike before the anti-ballistic missile program came into full deployment. Given the paranoia and aggression of the early 80s, Andropov believed that a first strike by NATO was likely, and he started the Operation Ryan initiative. Operation Ryan was a massive intelligence-gathering activity led by the KGB. Its goal was to analyze intelligence data that would indicate an imminent attack by the West and recommend appropriate action. So to summarize, 1983 saw the world move closer to a war due to a unique set of circumstances. Short-range nuclear missiles had been deployed to Western Europe. The new Star Wars system threatened the balance of power. A civilian airliner was shot down by the Russian Air Force. And to top it off, we had two new leaders of the two nuclear superpowers, one very anti-Soviet and the other prone to believe that the Americans were up to something. It was against this backdrop of rhetoric and paranoia that NATO embarked on Operation Able Archer in November 1983. The operation was designed to test NATO's leadership in response to a simulated invasion of Western Europe by the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries. As with any military exercise, the scenario was planned well in advance, and the simulated events that had led up to the exercise had already taken place when it started. Thus, in responding to the exercise scenario and invasion, the leadership, again as part of the exercise, requested the transition from conventional to nuclear weapons. The NATO exercise reached the highest levels of government, with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl having roles in the nuclear exercise. This was, of course, noted by the KGB. The KGB also noted a high level of secure communication between the NATO allies, specifically between the United States and the United Kingdom. NATO also was using a new, more secure messaging format during the exercise, leading the KGB to over-exaggerate the importance of these messages. Additionally, as part of the war game scenario, NATO forces simulated the escalation of its alert levels from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 1. The KGB agents of Operation Ryan misinterpreted this as an obvious indication of preparation to begin military operations. They reported to the Soviet leadership that it is considered that war is inevitable. The KGB reported their observation and events surrounding Operation Able Archer. The interpretation by some Soviet leaders was that it was not just a series of war game scenarios, but an elaborate ruse to hide the actual deployment and first strike on the Soviet Union. Documents and testimony released after the fall of the Soviet Union reveal that the world was much closer to a nuclear war than many had believed at the time. In fact, nuclear-capable aircraft in Poland and East Germany were placed on high alert. Warheads were also loaded into Soviet bombers stationed in East Germany. This was, in fact, the Soviet Union hedging its bets in case of an actual first strike from NATO. In this scenario, they could at least respond with something, but it was clear they didn't know what was happening in the West. As with previous conflicts in the Cold War, cooler heads prevailed, having been made aware of the higher alert settings. NATO officials chose not to follow suit, instead waiting till the end of the exercise to see if the Soviets de-escalated their alert levels. What we know of the reactions to Able Archer come from declassified documents and accounts from the fall of the Soviet Union. This and document requests from the Freedom of Information Act give us an idea on how paranoia can cause leadership to vastly misinterpret events and bring the world to the brink of war. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does help the channel out.